Yeah, I know. Just, I'm not looking forward to it. Signing those papers just seems like it makes it final, you know?
The sooner you sign, the sooner you can stop paying rent and actually own a home.
I'd much rather still have them. I'd give anything for just one more day, you know? Listen, I gotta let you go.
Expecting someone?
I'll call you back. You are at home, a home hard won by you and your family, defending against any number of threats from starvation to greedy monarchs and even unseen forces, unknown complications. Your sister's chores, churning milk into butter, inexplicably made impossible by some hidden power that only a scientific method not yet invented would eventually reveal as the fact that the poorly refrigerated milk had curdled. A knock on the door announces a beggar, a well-known vagabond that consistently troubles your family, beseeching support you can poorly afford. There are whispers that this same vagabond converses with supernatural forces, and these whispers have given you a fear that often has convinced you to offer a loaf of bread or perhaps a few coins. But today, with the news of your sister's frustrated attempts at churning, you have no more patience, even if the vagabond does hold sway over demonic powers. You even tell yourself that if the vagabond does have such powers, maybe they have already cursed your family, causing the milk to refuse to churn. You refuse the vagabond and tell them to leave, but as you do, you notice an evil sneer on the frustrated beggar's face, a demonic, evil sneer that sends shivers down your spine. Reporting this selfsame sneer to your neighbor, she advises you to make a wax effigy of the vagabond to protect you with a counterspell. She describes the method, and still fearing what might befall, you make the effigy but promise you won't use it unless absolutely necessary. Time goes on, and things, while still difficult, return to normal. You forget the quarrel with the vagabond, but one day another knock on the door. There stands the wretch, reeking and requesting aid yet again. While you still fear the reports of their supernatural abilities, you are boldened by the effigy you fabricated for protection. You even risk telling them in no uncertain terms to begone. Smiling as the troublesome figure vanishes into the distance, you turn your attention to excitement as you ponder the new pastor. His passionate scriptures on the importance of guarding against heresy fills your heart with glee as you can't help but compare him to the stuffy, dry pastor before who, while certainly pious and wise, often had you struggling to stay awake during sermons. Time moves forward, just as it always inevitably does, and after a few weeks another knock on the door fills you with dread. Has the local vagabond crawled out looking for you yet again? Instead, you see the new pastor standing beside a tall, foreboding figure who introduces himself as a witch finder. "Oh dear," you say, "have we a witch in our midst?" The pastor avoids eye contact as the witch finder asks for you to follow me, please. You are taken and informed that you were identified as a witch, and your accuser? The selfsame vagabond that has pestered you and your family for years. During the investigation, you are stripped of your clothes and examine for witch marks right down to your most sensitive areas. The investigator proclaims that a mark is found between your anus and pudendum, a so-called witch's teat. Embarrassed, confused, you assure the investigators of your purity. You had no interest in converse with evil spirits, and no interest in Satan and his imps. But still, the investigation continues, and you are subjected to a walking investigation. This sounds quite pleasant until you realize it means you will not be allowed to stop moving, not to rest, not to use the washroom, and even after many hours that turn into days, not even to sleep. After 2 days, you start to see strange figures come out of the shadows. No one can tell you that sleep deprivation is now causing you to hallucinate. No one knows what sleep deprivation is. You think to yourself that surely here are Satan's imps come to harass you, but why? And how, when you have been pious, except you remember the wax effigy you had made to protect you from the vagabond? Hadn't the new pastor warned that even counter magic was heresy? Am I a witch? You ask the creatures crawling from the shadows, who laugh and cackle at you incessantly. Your trial is set, but you are in a serious crisis of faith. If God has allowed you to be visited by these spectral figures, are you truly as pious as you thought? Maybe the effigy had indeed welcomed Satan into your heart. During the trial, when it finally arrives, you sigh in relief when your sister is called to witness. Surely, you are saved. But she reminds you not only of the effigy, but of your many cruel words said to her either in impatience or frustration, her being much younger than you and prone to moments that demanded a disciplined, hard heart. Other members of the community profess to every moment you ever lost your temper or were less than charitable. Every tiny moment of weakness is scrutinized in great detail. And much to your surprise, some of these witnesses even start convulsing in terror, saying you are casting spirits to torment them. Left feeling worthless and damned, exhausted, you are asked to confess. Still hallucinating from sleep deprivation, you even see Satan himself in the audience, smiling. Added to all this, you have heard of similar trials elsewhere that allowed those who confessed to live and sent those who refused to confess to die by execution. Maybe this was God's grace that if you confess, you can begin your redemption. I confess. It doesn't seem enough. I am a witch. It almost feels good to get it over with. You barely care that you are far from freedom. The judges sentence you to death, to be cut by a sword until a cartwheel can be driven between your head and your neck. At this point, it feels like just a variation of freedom. The word witch was first recorded in English as the Old English words wicke for female and wicca for male, with the earliest use appearing circa 890 AD in the laws of Alfred. The word itself traces back to Proto-Germanic wiccana, meaning to practice sorcery, and is also the root of the word wicked. Early in Christianity, witchcraft, while certainly frowned upon, was considered a lesser crime than heresy, which, as we examined in our previous video, was considered worthy of eradication by crusade. It wasn't until 1428, when in Valais, Switzerland, that the investigators of the church started to explore trying witchcraft in a court of law. And this first sanctioned witch hunt lasted 8 years and resulted in the death of 367 people. Far from satiating the bloodlust demanded by these trials, the event inspired one of the most influential texts of the witch trials, Malleus Maleficarum, translated as Hammer of the Witches by Heinrich Kramer in 1486. Instead of calming the waters, Kramer felt the early trials had, if anything, been far too lenient. For Kramer, witchcraft was not a separate crime from heresy, but instead the ultimate expression of it, an insult to the almighty power of God, replacing his pious presence with faith in Satan as exhibited by conversing with him and his imps. While early witch trials were obviously a travesty of injustice against innocent victims, most predominantly, though not exclusively, women, they at least required some tangible event to attach to in order to proceed to trial. The storm that day should not have caused a disaster. Many Norwegian fishermen were skilled sailors, as generations of their Norse ancestors had been. They could read clouds and tides, predict rain and gales. Even if all their experience failed them and they went into the water, they were better protected against the cold than almost anyone else on Earth. They often wore leather overalls that formed a waterproof bag around their bodies. Underneath was a thick multi-layered coat of woolen insulation. Yet none of this saved the men of Vardo and its surrounding settlements. 40 of them drowned that day in 1617, and their womenfolk and children were left to mourn uncomprehendingly in half-empty villages. But during the witch trials, a new possibility emerged that might account for the terrible death toll. Perhaps it could be explained retroactively by witchcraft. Eventually, however, suspicion and paranoia would change even this requirement. And by the time of the most infamous witch trial of all, it was no longer required to have tangible, if highly circumstantial, evidence. By the time of the Salem witch trials, what was called spectral evidence could prove sufficient to accuse someone of witchcraft. This spectral evidence could come in many forms, such as a nightmare in which the accused appeared to wish harm on a victim, or even seizures which the medical science of the time was incapable of diagnosing as what was likely PTSD, the victims often having survived brutal attacks on their colonies by natives or other similar hardships. But not having an understanding of trauma, the seizures were seen as spirits sent by figures that were already at odds for various reasons against their community. Indeed, a common thread in the accused was that they were often described as quarrelsome. But it wasn't just society punishing the cantankerous. Without any real safeguard against frivolousness, the limits were also nowhere to be found. Perhaps the most important feature of inquisitorial procedure for present purposes is that it did away with the earlier custom of judicial penalties for an accuser who failed to substantiate his charges. In trial for sorcery, it would be particularly difficult for the accuser to prove his case because the alleged culprit was not connected with the victim in the usual ways. The sorcerer might carry out his deeds several blocks away from the scene of the crime. Prior to the development of inquisitorial justice, it must therefore have been particularly dangerous to accuse someone of sorcery, or of witchcraft generally. In one peculiar case, a man accused a woman of weather magic, and when he was unable to prove his claim, he himself was drowned. It is significant to note that Satan is often referred to as the accuser. For as much as certain figures acted with at least the stated goal of cleansing their society, the Salem witch trials are hardly looked back on as a pious moment of history. Beginning in the year 1692 and ending in 1693, 200 people would ultimately be accused during what would later be known as the Salem witch trials. Of those, 30 people would be found guilty and 19 executed by hanging. Of those 19, there'd be 14 women and 5 men, and 1 man, Charles Corey, would be crushed to death. The trials began with a group of young girls in the village experiencing strange fits that they attributed to several local women casting spells on them. As mentioned previously, a variety of techniques for extracting a confession was sharpened to the point of perfection by the time Samuel Parris's Native American slave was accused by his daughter Betty Parris and her cousin Abigail Williams. A combination of torture, threat of punishment, and a probable desire to appease her owner led Tituba to not only confess but to provide her own prodigious list of accusations of her own. By the time the dust settled on the trials themselves, 19 people were hanged, and 1 man who dared to try and defend the accused, Charles Corey, was pressed to death. It is said that when asked to confess his guilt, Charles merely replied, "More weight," until he ultimately succumbed, his own tongue being squeezed from his head. According to reports, one of the executioners pushed it back with a stick. Quite possibly the only positive note to speak of the entire affair of Salem, Massachusetts was that, for what may have been the first time, or at least the most profound moment, intense shame and guilt was an after effect. Despite figureheads such as Cotton Mathers, who hadn't directly participated in the Salem trials but who did enact a ban on all publications of the event, Thomas Mall risked litigation by publishing Truth Held, Forth, and Maintained in New York to try to skirt the ban. Officials imprisoned him for 12 months for his troubles, but the fact that he was ultimately acquitted for the charge of seditious libel is sometimes viewed as the first victory for freedom of the press in America. It feels macabre, to say the least, to say anyone was inspired by the shadows cast by the witch trials. Perhaps it is a morbid fascination with the fears we still feel of the unknown. Perhaps history itself is awed by the handful of figures who stood up and tried to defend the accused from persecution by prosecution. Whatever the reasons, the image of the witch has, it seems, never gone out of vogue. From Halloween costumes with black pointy hats to successful musicals, the image at times seems to speak more of quiche than fearsomeness. Yet works such as Ligeia by Edgar Allan Poe and The Dreams in the Witch House by H.P. Lovecraft paint a much more frightening image. He was in the changeless, legend-haunted city of Arkham, with its clustering gambrel roofs that sway and sag over attics where witches hid from the king's men in the dark, olden days of the province. Nor was any spot in that city more steeped in macabre memory than the gable room which harbored him, for it was this house and this room which had likewise harbored old Keziah Mason, whose flight from Salem jail at the last no one was ever to explain. That was in 1692. The jailer had gone mad and babbled of a small white-fanged furry thing which scuttled out of Keziah's cell, and not even Cotton Mather could explain the curves and angles smeared on the grey stone walls with some red, sticky fluid. From the dark magic of Clive Barker's imagination, see Hellraiser and Lord of the Illusions, to the modern take in such films as Weapons, it is clear that our psyches still fear what dark magic is possible for those unafraid of convening with evil spirits. Perhaps most interesting is the modern pivot that sees a larger populace self-identify as witches, or as the modern parlance has it, the culture of Wiccan. At the time of this video, it is estimated that 3 to 5 million people worldwide identify as Wiccan, which actually significantly outnumbers the estimated 40 to 60,000 lives lost globally during the entire span of the witch trials. It is a wonder the witch finders don't roll out of their graves. But it isn't surprising that the image of witchcraft has lived on, both in fearsome tales of malevolent forces, campy films such as Hocus Pocus and Wicked, but also, interestingly enough, in rebellious spirits who, among many potential reasons for proclaiming themselves witches, scorn the witch hunters and mock their graves. And much like the scorned memories of the witch finders, join us next time as we examine another kind of haunt whose legacy has fed the coffers of the horror genre, as we examine the history of the haunted house. Did I miss any details you want examined? Any further topics you want me to explore? Please leave any requests in the comments, and if you like what we are doing here, please share with anyone you think might be interested in the project. And of course, don't forget the obligatory like and subscribe.